This video is sponsored by Warcraft Rumble. Painting miniatures is one of the most relaxing and chilled parts of my day where I can just unwind, settle down and paint some badass from a far off realm. However, for a lot of beginners getting into hobby and even people that have been doing it for a long time, it can be quite daunting, off-putting and stressful, which is not great. You don't want stressful when painting. Now, there's plenty of talented painters out there that are awesome and make us all look bad. You know who you are if you're watching this. If you're watching this, why? Don't know why. And there's a lot of people out there as well that will give you lots of feedback, which is good, sometimes contradictory. Hopefully, I'm not going to do that today. And I'll give you some important tips in the process and beginning steps of painting miniatures. This is not a list of you must do this, more of a guideline, because this is coming from a man who's been painting for years and has made every mistake known to painting. Now, to showcase these points and topics, we are going to be painting up a bunch of figures sent to us by Blizzard based on the Warcraft Rumble figures. They're super cute, but they're really good for teaching all these basic techniques. So settle in, watch me paint some figures, but before we do that, let's hear a little more from our sponsors. Warcraft Rumble is an action-packed strategy game that invites players to assemble armies with their favourite characters from the Warcraft universe and battle it out in unique missions designed to test their tactical wits. It's easy to learn, but hard to master. Warcraft Rumble's frantic strategy action is immediately gripping, with depth that rewards experimentation. Build forces of minis, starting with leaders like Archmage Jaina Proudmoore, with a huge single-player experience with over 70 missions, as well as weekly and monthly challenges in the form of multi-part dungeons. There's so much to keep you busy. You can also play with your friends in competitive or cooperative play, and join guilds to link up with fellow commanders. There are over 60 heroes, villains, and monsters from the Warcraft universe to choose from, and these are lovingly sculpted digital characters that have been rendered as tabletop-style minis and brought to life for you to collect. Warcraft Rumble is full of authentic Warcraft vibes created by the team with deep roots in the franchise. Everywhere you look, you'll encounter many references inspired by beloved characters, locations, and events from the Warcraft PC strategy games and the World of Warcraft. As you can see, we've already got hold of our Warcraft Rumble characters courtesy of WePrint Miniatures. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description and get downloading. Right, back to painting and talking about painting techniques. Now let's look at our first part of the miniature painting process, which is, I would probably argue, quite important, which is undercoating. It's also known as priming and spray coating. It's the same thing. You might hear lots of different terminologies, but this is, I would say, quite key because it means you get some colour onto your miniatures, usually a solvent spray, and that then gives the rest of the paint something to stick to. Without it, it could rub off or flake off. So it is key for most miniatures to get an undercoat on there. Now, the great thing about undercoating figures is if you pick a colour, this can speed up your painting process. So if you've got a figure that's in armour, you can spray in silver or gold. If you've got a figure that's mainly red, you can spray it red. There's plenty of painting companies out there that supply a vast array of colours, whether that's AK, Colourforge, Army Painter, Citadel, they have a good selection. And then you can pick from that, and that will speed along the process. Like I said, it's about picking the majority of the colour on your model and then getting that on, and then you can just pick out the other details as time goes on. Now, sometimes you might not be flush with cash, or you might only have one space for one spray paint, or let alone the cost for one spray paint. Now, I used to only have black and white when I first started in the hobby, and that was fine because if I was doing bright colours, I'd spray them white. If I was doing dark colours, I'd spray them black. If you can only get one, I would suggest getting grey, a nice standard sort of mid-grey. There's plenty of companies that do different tones of grey, but Mechanica Standard Grey from Citadel is the go-to. So anything that looks similar to that, because you can go dark quite quickly with it, you can go light quite quickly with it. If you had to paint yellow on a model and you only have black spray, it's a bit harder. If you wanted to paint black on a white undercoated model, it's a bit harder. But as you can see, we've sprayed a multitude of figures here. We've got some that sprayed grey, silver, black. You know, there's a whole multitude of colours. If you can get hold of other colours, it just helps because it's about speed sometimes, because we don't have millions of hours in the day to sit there undercoating by hand. Speaking of which, undercoating by hand, that can be done. It's a little bit more dubious, and we're going to go into the base coating bit a bit more later on. But if you don't have an undercoat, or you don't have access to any kind of sprays, whether you're too young for it or you just can't afford it, getting a base paint and applying that over in a couple of thin coats will get you there as well. It's probably not as good. It will rub off as time goes on, but it definitely gets the paint on the model. Also, a word of warning when it comes to spraying miniatures. If it's too cold or too hot, it can affect the end result. So try and find a time of day that's like a nice warmth, that's not too hot, not too cold. Unfortunately, there'll be a few of you maybe watching this video now in really hot environments or really freezing cold environments that don't have that. So in that case, maybe base coating by hand or even getting hold of an airbrush. Airbrushing is something we're going to talk about in another video, but airbrushing is quite useful because you can do it inside. So now we looked at undercoating, priming, spraying, whatever you want to call it. We're now going to move on to, I would say, a really good foundation of any painting, and that's base coating. Base coating is this part of the painting where you get to block out all those colours, get an idea of if the colours are going to work together, and then you're ready to move on to the next steps. Without base coating, it just makes it very hard to do the next steps like shading and highlighting. Now, there are paints that are specifically designed for base coating. AK have an intense range, which has got a lot of pigment in it. Citadel also have their base range as well, and there's plenty of other companies out there that have similar variants of base paints. Base paints just have more pigment in, so they cover better, they're more opaque in their coverage. However, I would recommend, regardless of how designed the paint pot is or the style of paint, you still need to thin it down. You still need to do multiple thin coats. And the reason for doing that is if you just use it straight from the pot, it'll be really thick, it'll be really goopy, it'll clog up your detail, and you get loads of brush strokes and often brush hairs in the miniature, and it just looks really unsightly. When you come to do any kind of base coating, layering, etc., doing multiple thin coats is better because you get smoother coverage. It doesn't clog up the detail as much. It might seem like a bit long-winded, like, well, I'm doing several coats, but actually it just has a better finish. So that's something to bear in mind when you're doing base coating. Now, when it comes to thinning the paints down themselves, there is a bit of a trick. There is no sort of like hard and fast rule when it comes to thinning paints down, because sometimes you might use a layer paint to base coat because it's the right tone. Sometimes you might use a base coat to highlight because it's the right kind of tone. But for the most part, there's plenty of base coats that cover most of the colours you need. But like I said, they are thick. So when you're thinning them onto the palette, sometimes you have to judge it by feel. Like I say, some base paints are just thinner than others. That is just the way. Every paint, every colour is different, and you will, as time goes on as a painter, you will get used to this. I could sit forever showing you a palette of every colour possible, but then there's new colours coming out all the time and formulations get reformulated. So the best hard and fast rule is just judge it by feel. If you start to see, usually if you've got like a white palette pad or like white palette paper, if you start to see more of that white showing through, it's probably too thin. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's better to have too thin a coat than too thick a coat, because you can always add a second or a third. And I found, like with undercoating like bright colours like pink over black, that needs more coats. Painting yellow over black needs a hell of a lot more coats, and often goes green if you're not careful, which is why we referred to in the spray coat section, maybe using grey, and then there's less coats needed. So sometimes getting that tone can help. So the undercoat will help influence the base painting side of things as well. But yeah, thinning down takes a bit of time. Rule of thumb that I use, 2 parts water, 1 part paint. That's nice and thin, and sometimes you can always add a little bit more paint if it seems too thin. But just take your time and maybe try it on the base first before you apply it on the actual model. That's always a top tip as well. Just try it on your base, wipe a little bit off on your thumb, as long as you're not allergic to it, and then start applying onto the model. Now, one thing to remember about base coating is it's the initial step. So if you're finding it's quite messy, you've got like some red on a black belt, or you've got like some armor color on the skin, don't worry, because you can tidy up. This is the part where you can afford to be messy. It's what we call the ugly stage. And there are always, sometimes later on, you might find the ugly stage. You might get multiple ugly stages. It's got to get worse before it gets better. Accept that. Don't worry about it. Don't look at whatever someone else has put on the internet and gone, look at this amazing model I've base coated. Chances are they probably spent 14 hours base coating that, making it look super neat. Don't worry about it. Just take your time. If you make mistakes, you can tidy up at a later point. And accept, like I said, it's going to look ugly for a time. It's fine. As I alluded to in the spray coating section, you can base coat by or undercoat or prime by hand. Again, that is just following the same principles as we just talked about with the base coating. Still apply it as a thin coat. Some paints, like the AK ones, I did find that I could use them straight from the pot and they weren't too thick and goopy. Other times I did have to thin them. Again, that's through experience and getting familiar with the range of paints that you've got at hand. So I think that's just the key thing. Get used to what you've got and then slowly add paints in as time goes on. Another thing you'll see when I'm painting as well with the footage that's going on the screen now is sometimes you might want to start with the lowest color and then build up. So if we take the Huntress, who's riding her amazing looking panther, I'll start with the skin first because that's the lowest texture. Then I'll move up to the purple armor, get that all base coated, do a couple of coats of that. Then I'll pick the actual silver trim. So a good tip and trick is to start the lowest sections, be messy, and then you can neaten up as you pick up those raised sections, and just take your time. And inevitably you'll probably find you get some purple on the skin again, you have to tighten it back up. That is just the war of painting. Sometimes if you're going fast or you're a bit messy, that will happen. Don't worry about it. So you've got your miniatures undercoated, they've now got some base coats on. We want to get some definition on those, and for that there are shades. There are plenty of companies that do a variety of different shades. Citadel have shades, AK have deep shades. There's so many things. You can even thin down paint so much that you can just run them into the recesses. What do shades do? Well, what they do is they go into the recesses, they kind of add shadows and darkness to your miniatures, which helps punch out definition. So then you're seeing the raised areas of the model, you're seeing like all the details in those nooks and crannies. And shades are just a really quick way and a cheaty way of getting all those things picked out with very minimal effort. Now, there's plenty of people out there that want to sit and get like a bit of black, really thin it down, and then run into the cracks of Space Marine armor or a footman from the Alliance. You know, you can run around all the recesses of that if you want to and get all those recesses defined by hand, or you can just apply a shade all over. There's multiple ways of doing shades. There's an all over shade, there's picking out just sections, so that is like an all over on the armor, but just picking out the skin after or whatever. Now, they are quite watery. It is quite misleading when you're first looking like, what are these? These are really watered down paints. Don't worry, because that's what they're designed for. They're designed to just run across the model and then settle in the recesses. Now, word of warning, when this happens, two things can happen. They can just run straight in the recesses, but then start to pull. So you've got to be mindful when they start to pull. You might want to get a brush that's dry and just soak off some of that recess. It's what I call wash. Just got to keep an eye on the model and make sure you're not getting some horrible puddles. As you can potentially see on the shield here for the footman, there's a bit of a dribble underneath the line design on the shield. I've accepted that. I'll tidy that up later when I come to like layering and doing some tidying up. That's fine. That will happen. Again, ugly stage, we mentioned this. Another thing to bear in mind as well is shades can sometimes dry blotchy on surface areas away. If they're not thin enough or you want to thin them down, they'll go in the cracks more, but sometimes if they're a little bit thicker, they will get a bit blotchy on surface areas, like large surface areas. So not great for tanks, great for things with lots of detail. The other thing you'll find with shades, certain companies have shiny ones and certain companies have super matte ones. And sometimes if you're really lucky, you get somewhere in the middle, like a satin tone. Citadel, their current range of shades dry quite shiny, which is great for armor. It's great for leather if you want shiny leather, and great for like oily skin or sweaty skin and stuff like that. Not so good for cloth and bone if you want the bone to be quite dry. So sometimes you have to pick the shade for the task you want it to do. AK have deep shades. I really like deep shades. They kind of give a nice blend as well as they dry. They're a little bit more viscous in their makeup, so they take a bit longer to dry, but they give a nice blend. But they dry super matte, perfect for cloth and hair and bone. Not so great if you want shiny armor. So you might want to pick and choose what shades you use for certain elements, and that's fine. You know, that's why you have so many different companies with so many different ranges of paint. And with the blotchy thing, you can avoid that by thinning the paint down more. You can use water to thin down shades. If you use too much water, then it breaks the shade and you'll find you get weird sort of like white crust in the recesses. So some companies supply you with medium. AK supply their deep shades with a deep shade medium. If you thin it down with that, it's just paint without pigment. So it won't break the paint, you won't get the crust, but you can still thin it down. If you use water, 50-50, you're fine. 60-40, water versus paint, you're fine. Any more than that, then there's a danger of it starting to get a bit crusty in the cracks. So that's when you want to start using the medium for that. And that's the same for contrasts, which we're going to move on to in a moment. So contrasts, this step has often been seen as its own way of painting miniatures. I see it as an extra tool for the toolbox, your painting toolbox. You can paint miniatures from scratch just using nothing but contrasts or express paints or speed paints. There's a few companies out there that do their own versions of them, each with their own pros and cons. The concept of these paints, these contrast speed paints, express paints, is they do a multitude of things. When you apply it over the model, it's going to base coat the area, it's going to shade the area, and as it dries, it pulls away from the edges and kind of highlights the area. Great, hey? You know, you just apply a colour all over a model and your figure's finished. Yes and no. You will need to thin them down. You will need to be mindful about pooling, blotchy areas and stuff like that. So heavy textured models that are like fur or chainmail or dragon scales, they're perfect for contrast because they've got lots of texture for it to do its effects. Large flat areas struggle a little bit more. You need to really work on to applying those contrasts. There's lots of tones and colours. This is why I say it's good to add to your toolbox of painting. It's not necessarily a whole painting process in its own right. So when you're using contrasts, maybe do it for the skin all over on a model. Now, if you take, for example, the model I'm painting here, I'm going to use all contrasts on this particular model. I'm going to paint all over the skin, first of all, with a brown tone, Gorgunter fur here from Citadel. It is quite blotchy on the first coat. Then I'm going to add other colours like the red for the robes, some blue for the trim. Looks great when you start getting highlights on it and you start adding other colours to it. On its own, it can certainly, because it's large flat areas, it can look a little bit bitty, a little bit wishy-washy and a bit blotchy. If you start adding more of the contrast to the surface area, it can get quite streaky as well. But in places, if you're quite tactical about it, you can run into the cracks a bit more and then start to get a bit of definition. So sometimes once I've applied a couple of contrasts, like on the red robes, I might run some more into the recesses of the robes, which adds a bit more punch and a bit more contrast. That's the other thing to bear in mind, is you hear a lot of terminologies in painting like punch the contrast out and use contrast paint. So there's two terms. There's a type of paint and also an effect, which is like getting more punch out of your colour, as well as using a weird thin down paint that does everything for you, apparently. Now, when using contrast, it's good to start with a light undercoat. This really helps with like punching out those raised areas when it starts to dry and gives you a highlight. And also the colours work better with bright undercoats because they're more punchy. You can use them on other ones, but they work better with bright undercoats. You will see it looks quite nice over silvers as well. If you want to like a nice cheeky metallic effect, you can just get a contrast of your choice and apply it over a silver undercoat or even a gold undercoat, and it will look like a metallic because the metallic elements will show through because it is quite translucent. So you will get a lot of the metallic elements shown through. So on the plane of this safe pilot, you will see it just gives it a nice copper effect, which is really, really good. And that is very minimal effort, maximum effect. Now, when doing any kind of contrasts, expect you're going to get one contrast paint onto another section by accident. You know, when we do base coating, we're talking about base coating. You apply a colour on, it's going to be a bit messy. It's got the ugly stage. It's great. You can always tidy back up with those base paints. They're designed to be painted over. They're pigment heavy. Contrasts are quite translucent. So if you make mistakes, you have to repaint that section with your undercoat. And usually there's a colour that matches that. So we use Wraithbone as the undercoat spray. There's a pot of Wraithbone paint, which you can then paint over that area. But then it gets a bit weird because it gets streaky. It's different to the undercoat. It's not the same. So once you start making mistakes with contrast, it gets a bit harder to recover it and to fix it, which is why I don't think contrasts are super beginner friendly. They're great as an extra tool for like skin or like an effect like bone, but relying on it to paint an entire model, it makes it hard, especially when you've got multiple colours, as you can see on the model here, where it's got reds and blues and browns and blacks. Once you start getting one of those colours on another area, it's so hard to recover. So bear that in mind when using contrasts. So the last section of our beginner guide is going to be touching on layering. Now, layering can sometimes be seen as an advanced technique. I don't necessarily think so. I mean, if you're going for blends and like effects, then maybe you could argue it is. But for some of the basics, it's actually just a basic technique of like making a colour a bit lighter. I have multiple ways of using layering. Sometimes after I've base coated the model and I've shaded the model, I then get that base coat and layer back over the top. Only the raised areas, so you've still got some definition in those recesses of the shade. So you're still seeing the shade in the cracks. Another way, if you're starting from a black undercoat, for instance, and you want yellow, you might start off with a dark yellow and then go to a mid-tone yellow and then go to a really light yellow, but you're painting those coats entirely over the model in all the cracks and all the raised areas, everything. You're just completely tinting the entire model with these different steps of yellows to eventually build up to a bright yellow. That is a nice way of layering a model, because You could go with a light yellow and spend 14 days base coating 140 coats over that to try and get that bright yellow, which won't work because it will just go green and look really weird and blotchy. So layering is designed really as a tidy up stage, and also the first step before you start doing any highlighting. So with layering, if you want to punch out the colors a little bit more, let's take Jaina here, for instance. We've got some white on her and we've got some pink on her, but we've coated all over those sections with a dark shade. So all I'm gonna do is just get some white, and I'm just gonna tidy up the white areas, and I get some pink and tidy up the pink areas. And that is just using the same color I base coated with. It's just, again, a thin coat, and then just picking out those raised areas, but I'm not going into the cracks. I'm leaving that slightly darker color in the cracks to give some definition. So it's not highlighting as such, it's just building up another layer. That's all you're doing. You don't have to be super skilled to do this. There's no like fine tips on a brush and like steadying the hands and holding your breath and years of muscle memory required for this. It's just tidying back up. And weirdly, when you are layering and doing the tidying up stage, you can get a nice sort of gradient from just two colors, which is a base coat and a shade, and then reapplying the base coat. You get 3 tones from 2 colors, which is quite good. Now you'll find and see that a lot of expert painters will start with a dark tone and build up multiple layers up to a really light tone. So let's take pink, for example. They might start with a really, really dark magenta and build their way up to a mid-tone pink, all the way to a really, really bright fuchsia pink. We're not going to do that. That is definitely high-end painting, and that's something we can look at in another video. But with this one, back to the tidy up stage, you paint the pink, you wash the pink, you tidy back up with the pink. Nice and easy. And then if you do fancy it, you can then move on to the highlighting after to pick out folds in the cloth. But yeah, keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Just use that one color to re-tidy back up. That is the point. And it's the same with the skin. As you can see now on Jaina, you know, we base coated the skin, we shaded the skin. We're just using the same color just to pick out the key parts of her face, like the cheeks, the nose, the brow, the fingers, the knuckles, etc. It just adds a bit more punch. Now, when I refer to layer paints as a technique, there's also a range of paints. Again, Citadel have their range of paints. AK have a range of paints as well. Their 3rd gen stuff is really, really good for layering. You don't always have to use layer paints to layer. You can use them to shade. You can use them to base coat. It's the same with base coats. You can use them to highlight. I often pick the color that works for me. So sometimes when I'm highlighting things or I'm picking a tone, I really like that color and I will use that color as a base coat, or I just need more coats of it, that's all. Or a slightly darker color underneath before I use that. Which then goes into the argument of, but that's layering, Peachy. Yes and no. So don't always feel that I have to use this color because it says base or intense or whatever on the tub. Use a color that is what you want to use for your skin or your armor or your sword or whatever. It just means you need to do a couple more layers or less, depending on the type of paint you're using. And there we are. With the layering discussed, we're now at the end of our painting journey for beginners. So hopefully there's been a few things in here that's helped you out, whether you're a beginner, getting back into painting, or just top tips for anyone that is just, you know, unsure sometimes about what all these things mean, because sometimes it can be quite bewildering with all these different terminologies and jargon that gets thrown around. This is part 1 of a 3-part series. Part 2 will be incoming soon, and that is going to focus on more intermediate to advanced techniques such as highlighting, dry brushing, using an airbrush, etc. So do get ready to check that out. I hope you've enjoyed this video. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe, and of course a massive thank you to our patrons. Without this, we won't be able to do these videos and be in this beautiful backdrop that we're in now as well. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you to Blizzard for sponsoring this video. And of course, don't forget, if you want to do some joyful chaos, check out Warcraft Rumble. Till the next time, see you later. Bye-bye. Farewell, adieu.